Hello, everyone. We're so glad that you could join us for a walk in the garden. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance. Welcome to gardeners across the United States and to our international guests as well. As we all adapt to the challenges and restrictions of the coronavirus, we hope that these weekly virtual walks in the garden will add a bit of beauty to your day and inspire you to visit, create, and enjoy gardens in your area whenever possible. Today, I'd like to introduce Rebecca McMackin, who will take us on a garden journey into pollinator ecology. Rebecca is the Director of Horticulture at Brooklyn Bridge Park in Brooklyn, New York, where she manages 85 acres of diverse parkland organically and with an eye toward habitat creation for birds, butterflies, and soil microorganisms. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks, Penny. Hello to everyone, and I highly encourage you all to join the Ecological Landscape Alliance, which is kind enough to put on this webinar. It's a wonderful, wonderful organization. As Penny said, I'm Director of Horticulture at Brooklyn Bridge Park, and I make my living managing that park with a specialty in ecological horticulture. But my passion is pollination ecology. It's literally sex and flowers. It's flower sex, and I honestly don't know why anyone studies anything else. I really tried to make this lecture today as accessible as possible, so it's not just for plant nerds like me. But I will get into some really fascinating and new research, so if you already know the basics, just hang tight. I don't honestly know how long this lecture is going to go today. It might go a little bit over, so if you want to hang out after, and I will happily answer any questions that anybody has. So to jump right in, flowers are, if not the most beautiful things on earth, they are at least among them. But they're not really there just to look pretty as much as getting attention is part of what many flowers do. Their job, their primary function is reproduction. And in order to do that, in order to get pollen to transfer to a stigma, flowers employ an absolutely staggering and awe-inspiring range of strategies and processes, almost all of which are invisible to the vast majority of people. So today what I want to show you is what flowers are doing, why they get our attention, why they smell so wonderful and look so pretty. But then I really encourage you, if you can go outside now and look, or if we're all ever allowed to go outside again, my hope is that you'll go look at flowers and see who's visiting them and what they're doing. And this is all going to be really cool information and pretty pictures, but my real hope is to get you to see the natural world in a deeper level. So, pollination, as I mentioned, is plant sex. It's the transfer of the male genes to the female organs. And in plants, the male genes are in the pollen. And the pollen is released from the flower's anthers, which are right here. And it has to make its way to the female parts of the flower, the stigma, yoink, for pollination to occur. So that move right there, this move from anther to stigma, that is pollination. And everything after that is fertilization. And in that process, the pollen grain will germinate on the stigma, and a pollen tube will grow down the style and into the ovule and fertilize the ovule, and then of course the seed will start to develop depending on the plant. But pollination, again, it's just that initial move, and it looks like this in real life. So here's a lily flower that you've all probably seen, and here are these anthers that dye your clothes and stain your fingers. And here's that stigma right here, and you can notice that it's a little bit wet, and that's to trap and then even bring nutrients into the pollen grain when it lands on it. So there are 4 main ways to get pollinated. The first one is by animals, like bees, butterflies, beetles, and the occasional bird or bat. About 80% of plants rely on animals to pollinate them. And the big question here is, why would an animal pollinate a flower? And the answer is that they're getting something from the flower, or occasionally they're being tricked, but mostly they're gathering pollen or nectar, or they're getting pollen or nectar. And while they're doing that, the flower is sticking pollen to their bodies. And then when that animal visits another flower of the same species, they deliver that pollen to the receptive stigma of that other flower. So the flowers are essentially trading pollen and nectar for pollination. But then that's 80% of plants that are animal pollinated. And then 20% of plants are animal pollinated, and they're abiotically pollinated. And almost all of them just release their pollen to the wind and are therefore wind pollinated, like pine trees and grasses. And then there's a teeny tiny number of plants that are self-pollinated, meaning that they don't really get to have sex. Their own pollen hits their own stigma. And this is almost always as a backup strategy. Organisms really want to have sex, they want to exchange those genes, but when conditions aren't right, it's helpful and even critical to be able to produce seeds without having sex. So here is our common blue violet, and with a lovely spring flower that you can see right now. But in summer, they form these underground flowers, these white flowers right here. And those flowers never open. They never even see the sun. They live underground, and they pollinate themselves and produce seed themselves as a backup strategy. Similarly, jewelweed, our beautiful native annual jewelweed with yellow and orange flowers. When it's in the perfect condition, it produces those big, beautiful flowers that are hummingbird and bumblebee pollinated. But when it's in a too dry condition, it'll just make these little tiny green flowers that, again, they self-pollinate themselves. And there are some places on Earth where we've so thoroughly destroyed the environment that people have to hand pollinate fruits like apples, like in China, because there's no pollinators. So our fates are linked, and it's our job to protect pollinators as a matter of self-preservation. But also these organisms just have integrity beyond their quote-unquote service to us, and they deserve to live on Earth, and they're all reliant on each other. So when you remove a key pollinator, you lose the specialist flowers that relied on them, and you lose the birds that ate them. It's all interconnected. So if you want a healthy planet, and you want birds and beautiful flowers, we need to protect our pollinators. So back to flowers. This is a rose, as I'm sure you all know. It's a perfect illustration of those parts of the flowers. So here are the petals, of course, and then these are the anthers. Most pollen and anthers are yellow, and in the center is this group of stigmas. And so this is what we call a perfect flower because it has both male and female parts. Other flowers are male or female. So this is a begonia, and they're called imperfect. And so here are the male flowers with anthers and the female flowers with stigmas, and this is on one plant. A lot of us gardeners know that with plants like hollies, you get an entire shrub or a tree that is just a male or just a female. So there's a lot of different ways that plants organize their reproduction. But for imperfect flowers, even imperfect flowers like on this geranium, you can see that this plant doesn't want to self-pollinate, right? It wants to have sex. And so it has this strategy where it's male first, and the anthers are sending out their pollen first. And then only after the anthers have completed that job is the female stigma receptive. So it's avoiding self-pollination. And then a lot of plants, a lot of flowers that we think of as one flower are actually a collection of hundreds or thousands of tiny flowers called florets, which I think is such a pretty word, like on this sunflower. The flower head is surrounded by these big ray petals, but inside the flowers, inside the flower head, each one of these little florets has its own stigma and its own anthers and has to be pollinated by itself. And this is, of course, the case with a lot of composite flowers like asters and coneflowers. And here you can see that ring of yellow that is this ring of florets all flowering at the same time. And then as those florets get pollinated and the seed inside that coneflower grows, it gets bigger and bigger, and the Echinacea develops that cone that we're also familiar with. You can also see that on this flower, the only flowers that are left to bloom are way at the top. And so the bees that pollinate these flowers just do these tiny rings all around the top, and you definitely should go and see that. I had a video set up to show you, but I'm not even going to risk it because my computer is being so fussy right now. And so, but these flowers are really open. They make their resources really available. So there's a lot of other animals like this flower fly that will visit and take advantage of the pollen and the nectar. And the flower itself evolved to provide resources and hopefully get pollinated by a wide range of visitors. It's what we call a generalist. And even when the pollinators aren't doing the job of pollinating, they're still getting those resources. So here's a butterfly on an echinacea as well. You'll all see a lot of different types of animals on echinaceas. But this is a completely different flower. This is a lupin flower, and it's in the pea family, which all have similar flowers. And it's a very difficult flower to pollinate. And only large, strong bees can do it. Bumblebees will push down on the wing petals, and that triggers an anther to swing up and hit them in the abdomen. There's another video that I'm not going to show, but what I'll do is maybe I'll post all these videos to my Instagram page after this, and you can see them all there. And so this is really like a lock and key mechanism in contrast to the composites. This flower is a specialist. And long ago, it was in the plant's best interest to only allow, certain pollinators to drink its nectar and move its pollen. So it's not just available to anyone. It has this relationship with bumblebees because they're a really great partner. They are strong, they fly really far, they're very faithful to whatever species it is they're visiting that day, so they won't go to a pear and then an apple and then a daisy and then a lupin, because when they do that, they're not pollinating anything. They need to go from a lupin to a lupin to a lupin. So they're very consistent. And so a lot of flowers have grown to rely on bumblebees, particularly as specialists. Extreme specialization, where one species of plant has one pollinator partner, is incredibly rare. Most plants, it makes a lot of sense to rely on at least a few types of pollinators, but extreme specialization does occur, like with this bear claw poppy in Utah. It's endangered, and so is its pollinator, the poppy bee. But at some point, we have to imagine that it made a lot of sense for both to rely on each other, and there was much more abundance, but with climate change and environmental disturbance, they're now both really imperiled. And that is the case often with specialists, that they're very delicate, and when there are disturbances, they're the first to disappear, and they're the hardest to conserve. I work in Brooklyn, which is a city, and our ecology is usually comprised of a bunch of generalists for obvious reasons. It's more difficult to attract specialists to an urban park, for instance. So, this is our little poppy bee right here. So it's really good to have a backup plan. And we talked about the benefits of self-pollination as a last resort, and about half of flowers can do it when absolutely necessary, but it's really not ideal. They want to have sex. As I said, they want the introduction of new genes, which brings in random mutation and natural selection, all the benefits of evolution, but some flowers still rarely outcross, and they will almost always pollinate themselves or self. And this is a soy flower, and that's one of the flowers. This is one of the plants that does that. And the vast majority of their flowers self-pollinate every single time, which is incredibly reliable if you're a farmer. But if you're the plants and you really don't get to evolve as efficiently as other species. But again, it's a very reliable strategy as well. I'm just going to make a quick note here on anthropomorphization. And I think that hardcore science people, you're going to need to steel yourselves, because I'm going to do it like crazy. I think that humans are not amazing at nuance, and I find that with animals, and especially plants, it's often either a choice between personification or objectification. And while I'm not super thrilled or even consider it a compliment to include non-humans in our club, I just don't agree with materialistic views that deny animals emotions or deny plants agency. And I think the inclination to objectify living organisms is actually really, really dangerous. And it leads to a separation of people and nature. And then in extreme cases, you get factory farming and the levels of extinction that you see today. So I'm just going to talk about what plants want to do and how they make decisions. And that's just what it is. I'm definitely one of those people that like talks to bumblebees and stuff. But anyways, back to flowers. We didn't always have flowers on Earth. Plants moved onto land about 500 million years ago, and they came from the water, where they relied on water to reproduce because their sperm swam. and it still swims. Primitive plants like mosses and ferns require a thin film of water to reproduce on, and their sperm behaves a lot like human sperm. That's another video I'll post to Instagram. Anyway, what a lot of us did, mammals included, was to take an aquatic system and then essentially internalize it, where without going into too much detail, that fertilization process can really stay aquatic. And for terrestrial plants, to adapt to this condition, they needed to move their sperm through the air. Thankfully, the rest of us haven't gotten there yet, but plants figured this process out by enclosing their sperm in a tiny wax spaceship called pollen. The outer coating of pollen is amazing at keeping the pollen from drying out as it moves from one moist environment in the anther to another moist environment in the stigma. And once it lands on that receptive stigma, which if you remember is pretty moist and gooey, it infuses that pollen grain with moisture and even sometimes nutrients and allows it to move on to fertilization. So plants like pine trees figured this out, and many people suffer greatly each spring as a direct result of their pollen flying everywhere, but they still weren't flowers. These are not flowers, these are cones. And their pollen was moved around by wind, and their seed wasn't covered in a fruit like an apple seed is today. The name for this big group of plant is Gymnosperm, which means naked seed. But over time, about 150 million years ago, Gymnosperm seed started to evolve a cover, protecting them from insects and other predators. And key insect groups started eating their pollen, and then started relying on them as a food source, which then just completely changed the face of the earth forever. Because plants started relying on insects to move their pollen around rather than the wind, and then began offering pollen in more attractive and functional displays, i.e. flowers. And that, along with the seed productions, meant that flowering plants took over the world so quickly that Darwin called them an abominable mystery. So that today we've got about 250,000 species of flowering plants on Earth. There's about 250,000 species of flowering plants. And would anyone like to take a guess, to yourselves, I guess, about how many species of gymnosperm there are? There's about 800 to 900 species of gymnosperm. So you can see that flowers and flowering plants were just mind-bogglingly more successful on planet Earth. They're incredibly effective, particularly at driving speciation and evolution, because for the first time, pollen can be transferred outside of a little group, right? With wind pollination, which we'll look at later, everyone needs to be pretty close. All the trees need to be pretty close in a forest for all the pollen to get to the other cones. But for insect-mediated pollination, genes can transfer on the other side of a mountain, for instance. They can get outside of their little group. So the diversity just increases massively at this point. You also have an intelligent, sentient being making choices about which individuals get to reproduce. So flowers start getting flashier and sending out aromas. I think a lot of us like to think of insects as being really mechanically minded, but all of the flowers we think of as the height of beauty were painstakingly crafted and selected by insects over eons. I like to think that they're magnificent artists. And one of the reasons I love knowing this stuff is because I can look at a southern magnolia and thank a beetle, or I can look at an iris and thank these completely garish bees who just demanded such extravagance from a bearded iris. It's amazing. Anyways, the first pollinators were just beetles. And then wasps came later, and beetles were these big scarab beetles. And they weren't trying to pollinate anything, they were just eating the pollen. And so the first flowers, like magnolias and tulip tree flowers and water lilies, are these big, fleshy cups with robust petals that can hold a beetle. And there were no bees at this time. There were just wasps, and wasps are carnivores in that they feed their young meat. And today they still do this. You can see a wasp on a flower like this one, and they might still eat some pollen once in a while. But when they go to provision their nest for their young, they will go and paralyze a caterpillar, for instance, and lay an egg on that caterpillar so that their young is eating meat only. But back long ago, over 100 million years ago, some bees started relying on pollen as a food source and bringing it to their babies in order to rear those babies. And those wasps became bees. bees are essentially vegetarian wasps. And once bees developed this relationship, they took flower evolution to just a completely new level because their life cycles are so closely entwined with flowers. They have a direct mutualistic relationship. Even though bees aren't trying to pollinate anything on purpose, they still need to intentionally gather pollen in order to survive, in order to reproduce. So this link between the bees and the flowers is incredibly strong. And that is how flowers came about. But at this point, they do a lot more than just provide nectar and pollen. Flowers are much more complicated than just a place to eat. They make a great shelter. And a lot of insects will sleep in flowers, like these male longhorn bees. If you have asters in your garden or rudbeckia, they will spend all day fighting around a flower. They like to fight each other, and then as evening comes, they snuggle into the flower to sleep all together, and then they wake up and start fighting again. A lot of flowers are like this satellite dish that often face the sun and collect heat. And so they're a few degrees warmer than the surrounding air. So here's another little bee that I found sleeping in a geranium, which is like a warm little place to be. And here's a mallow bee that a gardener at Brooklyn Bridge Park found in a rose mallow. They like to sleep in there as well as collect the pollen. But some flowers don't just collect heat, they actually make it. This is the giant stinkhorn flower, Amorphophallus titanum. It is one of, if not the largest flowers in the world, and it's fly pollinated by the sorts of flies that most people find really gross, carrion flies. And in order to attract flies, it smells like fetid meat. And it even goes so far as to mimic the color of meat. This dark purple coloring is supposed to look like rotting meat, and the white even is supposed to look like muscle. But the craziest thing, again, is just that it generates heat so that disgusting stench of the flower gets wafted far into a forest and far away, luring in more and more flies. And you can see here that it gets so hot, it's nearly 100 degrees hot at the tip of the spadix. And that is just wild and crazy, but we actually have plants here in the Northeast in New York that do the exact same thing. This is our skunk cabbage flower. It might still be blooming in New York. It usually starts around mid-March, and it is also fly pollinated. And it is also colored to mimic old meat. And it also has those cream striations on the flower to look like muscle. And it generates so much heat that you can find them blooming in the snow with a little ring of melted snow around them. And I just love to imagine this totally psyched fly on a cold day finding this warm little room of rotting meat in the early spring, and they will sleep in there and cover themselves in pollen and then move on the next day to the next warm little meat house and then pollinate the flowers in there. And then because flowers are reliable places to find pollinators, there are whole food webs based around hunting on flowers. This is a crab spider who caught a flower fly, and crab spiders can actually change color to match the color of the flower they're on, from white to yellow. And they're hard to see, but the best way to find them is to look for a very still bee, and then you can usually see the spider from there. Flowers are also great places to get it on because males know that females are going to be there gathering pollen. And I think it's interesting, you can notice the relative size of the two male bees in this picture, which is not unusual in the insect world. But the broader point here is simply that flowers are more complex and interesting than a place to get food. They're rich, rich ecosystems all by themselves. So insect pollinated flowers have all these amazing tricks and techniques that we're really getting into just now, and more of that stuff is going to come later. But I also want to take a quick moment to go over wind pollination, because it's quite frankly really, really fascinating and gets a bad reputation because people think it's primitive. Because it evolved first, they think that these plants are unintelligent because there's no animals involved, and it's really just less than animal pollination. But it's quite elegant and marvelous. So slightly less than 20% of plants are wind pollinated, and all conifers, of course, are wind pollinated. But even some flowering plants like this maple tree here evolved back into being wind pollinated well after pollinators were available to carrying their pollen, because there's some real advantages there. It's certainly an expensive strategy to be wind pollinated because they have to produce tons and tons of pollen. That a very tiny percentage of that pollen makes its way to a female flower. But when you think about what they don't have to produce, it sort of balances out. Like, I would just like you to ask yourself if you've ever seen this flower before. And I think many of you who are not in the business of looking at flowers specifically will say no. And that's because this flower did not evolve to be seen. It does not need to be noticed by a pollinator. It doesn't need to get anyone's attention. So they're green, they're diminutive. They don't need to waste any resources on petals or nectar or anything like that. And they also have really brilliant strategies to minimize the waste of that pollen. So maple flowers, like oaks right now, they will flower before the trees put their leaves on. So the pollen doesn't get stuck on leaves. The air is flowing through the trees rather than around them. And a lot of wind-pollinated plants, like grasses, grow in large groups like a field, so that when they all send out their pollen, it's like this cloud of pollination, like an orgy, literally. And I won't get into this too much, but I just love it so much. When you talk about wind pollination, you really have to think a lot about fluid dynamics, because you just imagine the air swooshing around all of these objects. And a lot of pollination, a lot of wind pollination, is plants trying to break out of these boundary layers that surround objects in the wind. Sort of like if you imagine a leaf in a stream, it's like flowing down a stream and there's a rock in the stream. The leaf isn't going to crash into that rock. The water is going to carry that rock, the leaf, around the rock. And that's because there's a boundary layer of water around that rock in the stream. But with pollination and grasses, they want the pollen to crash into that rock. They don't want to get swept around objects. And so they have all these strategies, like having their anthers dangling out here as far away from the grass blade as possible, and the stigmas, these feathery stigmas as well. And there's neat research that shows that the oscillation of the flowering stems of grass in the wind will move at frequencies and with movements that literally shake up those boundary layers and kind of force the stem of the flower out outside of those boundary layers, so the pollen can get lifted up and away. So one wind-pollinated grass that we're all super familiar with is corn. These are the male tassels that produce the pollen, and they're in the top so that that pollen can get distributed as far as it can go. And these are the silks of the ears of corn that are the female parts of the flower. And then at the end, each one of these silks of an ear of corn, that's actually a stigma. So a pollen grain needs to land on each individual stigma and grow a pollen tube all the way down into the kernel of corn to fertilize it for that kernel to grow. And that's why you can get rainbow corn. You can do those fun experiments where you take purple corn and red corn and brush them on different halves of the silk and then get a rainbow piece of corn, because each one is corresponding. Each kernel is corresponding to different pollination. I'm going to just quickly skip through some stuff because I'm trying to get through a lot here. But pine cones are another really famously wind-pollinated plant, and also maligned and poorly understood, because male cones will send out just an insane amount of pollen. And none of it, I assure you, wants to get on your car. It's all trying to get to the female cones. And again, there are invisible, beautiful forces at play to get it to those female cones. When the wind moves by a pine cone, the cones are structured in such a way that they create tiny little eddies just beyond the cone in the wind. So the pollen will pass by a cone and then loop around and around, which then increases the chance of that pollen getting swept into the female cone. And some people have even speculated that the trees themselves are shaped, the conical shape of many pine trees are shaped in such a way that it swoops wind around the trees in order to kind of direct it into the cones. And one last thing I just want to say about pollinated plants is that their pollen is specifically shaped to fly through the air. It's very small and it's aerodynamic. And pollen on flowers that evolved with animal pollination is sticky. And it sometimes has spines on it because it wants to stick to an animal, and it never flies through the air. And here are two plants. And again, non-plant people, I wonder if you can recognize either of these plants. I think most of us and most everyone knows goldenrod on the left, right? It's a native plant that blooms in the fall. But the other one, few people have seen, and that is ragweed. It's also native, but it's wind pollinated. So its flowers aren't trying to get anyone's attention. They're just green. And as a result, a lot of people have never seen it. It's a very ecologically important plant, but most people hate it passionately because it produces so much pollen in the fall, and the pollen flies so far and is so powerful that it is one of the top allergy plants, and it occasionally even kills people with asthma. But the goldenrod, it blooms at the same time, and the goldenrod is bee pollinated. So it wants bees to find it, and it's electric yellow, so we all really notice it. And even though goldenrod pollen is so large and sticky that the only way to get it in your nose is to literally shove it in there, people just assume that they're allergic to goldenrod because they can see it and they can't see the ragweed. And it's completely unfair. And it's so widespread that my son's doctor mentioned goldenrod allergies to me one time. And when I was Googling pictures of ragweed for this, a picture of goldenrod actually came up. So tell your friends, goldenrod is a very important plant, especially for queen bumblebees, and it should be planted and not ripped out of the ground. But this plant is also trying to get noticed. This is our native Iris cristata, and it is also bee pollinated. And while we look at this and we see beauty, there is also a ton of information being passed along here because flowers are also methods of communication. The nectar and the pollen that the plants produce are very expensive, and from the flower's perspective, they want as many pollinators as possible to visit as quickly as possible, and then take as little resources as possible and pollinate them very thoroughly, and then fly away to another flower and do the exact same thing. They want to do as little work as possible. And from the pollinator's perspective, foraging is both exhausting and it is dangerous. And so they only want to visit a few flowers, and they want to get a ton of pollen and nectar and then go home and do their business. So neither side is messing around here. There's really high stakes, and it's in both sides' best interests to be as clear as possible with pollination. And so many flowers have developed what are called nectar guides. They are these beautiful shapes here on the petals. You can see these stripes of blue and white and yellow. And they are literally there to guide flying insects into the flower and show them where the nectar is. They're like landing strips that are guiding in pilots. They're also often yellow or have yellow on them because the thinking is that they're literally advertising their pollen, which is almost always yellow. And sometimes they're even tricking pollinators into thinking they have pollen when they don't. But it's like a big slice of pizza outside a restaurant that they're trying to advertise what they've got. And once you start seeing those nectar guides, they're really hard not to see. They're all over the place in these pansies and these foxgloves. That's what they're doing there. But there's also a lot going on that we can't see. So we've got 3 cone detecting cone cells in our eyes. You can see their peaks right here. We can see the purples, and then we can get all the way into the reds. Bees also have 3 cones in their eyes, but they're shifted way more into the ultraviolet spectrum than ours are. And so they see the world really differently. They can see ultraviolet light. And you'll also notice that they can't really see red light very well. And there's evidence that reddish colors appear brown or black to bees. Hummingbirds, on the other hand, have the best of both worlds. They can see well into the ultraviolet spectrum, but also they're very stimulated by reds. And because hummingbirds can see red so well and bees cannot, hummingbird pollinated plants are most often red, and we'll look at those a bit later. So this is a patch of Rudbeckia, of black-eyed Susans, as we might see it. And this is what it might look like under UV light, glowing for a bee. There are these really funny chat rooms online where people just apply different UV filters to flowers and guess what various animals see. This is what people think these flowers might look like to a butterfly. But again, we don't really know. Some butterflies have 15 photoreceptors as opposed to our 3. Many of them are focused in the UV spectrum. So we really just don't know how a butterfly sees a flower. But what we do know is that insects have compound eyes. And you'll see a lot of us have seen this sort of version of what people think insects see on the left, which is a bunch of little images of the exact same repeated image. But that's not actually true at all. What scientists think that compound vision actually looks like is that each little facet on a compound eye is like a pixel in an image. And so what they're seeing is a very, very poorly pixelated image of the things that we see. So it's not very clear, but they're seeing, of course, a wide variety of different information that we are seeing when we look into a flower. But there's also a lot more going on that we can't see. And if you look at flowers under black lights, it's pretty amazing to see what shows up. You can just buy a black light and put it in your closet. There's lots of different types of black lights. It's very, very fun. I highly recommend it. But there's a lot of images that show, again, a lot of information that these flowers are passing along to bees. They're saying how fast to fly, where the nectar is. They're telling the bees where, or other animals as well, where to land on the flower as well. A bullseye is a really common pattern here on the right. You can see both of these flowers, even a dandelion has a bullseye in it. And again, I just really recommend getting a black light and trying this. But there's also a lot of other communication going on that we can see. So when you look at the center of these asters, you can notice how one is bright yellow and one is brown. And so imagine how this would look to a bee flying over it. The yellow would just pop. And not only pop, but it would really glow. And that red-brown would appear as black. And so the if you want to take a guess to yourselves again, why those two things, why the plant has those two different colors, it's pretty clear that it's because the brown-red flowers have already been pollinated. And the yellow flowers have not been pollinated yet. So within a matter of minutes or hours after a flower has been pollinated, those flowers start to change color because they're signaling to the pollinators that they should not visit. And again, for the plants, this is both for the benefit of the plants and the pollinators because they both want this system as efficient as possible. This is a photo of Aster oblongifolium, and it has hundreds and hundreds of flowers on it. So imagine if we're up to a bee to figure out and test which flower had been visited and which one hadn't. It would be impossible. So with this system, as a bee flies over an aster, the non-pollinated flowers light up like stars and signal for them where they should even land. And this happens on almost all asters. It's one of those fun things that you can't unsee. It's really everywhere. And other flowers do this as well. This is on a clover that I noticed. You can see that the clover flowers not only change color here, but they also bend down once they've been pollinated. So they're physically, the bees are physically unable to get access to them. You can also see it here on this catalpa tree, or I'm sorry, Polonia. I think this is Polonia. I think it's catalpa. Anyways, you can see on these flowers that the nectar guides up at the top are yellow. They're bright yellow, and then they shift slowly from orange to red to even dark purple as time goes on and after they've been pollinated. Flowers will also change color when they're to show that they're ready to be pollinated, like these Virginia bluebells. This is a particularly beautiful process, but it's really no different than an apple ripening, for instance, showing us that they're ready to be eaten. And if that wasn't cool enough, just a couple of years ago, researchers found that bees can literally see sense the magnetic fields around flowers. And these are real scientists doing real research. It's not hippie aura stuff. And it all makes perfect sense because flowers have a negative charge, a negative electrical charge, because plants are essentially tubes of water that are attached to the earth, which is negatively charged. And so it's like the grounding wire in your stereo, that they have this negative charge connecting them to the earth. And bees are these fuzzy little balls of static, and they're picking up positive charges from the air. So when a bee lands on a flower, there's an exchange of electrons as the charge shifts on that flower. And people have even observed pollen jumping from an anther to a bee as that bee flies really close to the flower. But what's even crazier is that bees can read these charges and tell if a flower has been recently visited by another bee, and then again make their decision to land or not based on the electrical charge of that flower. Similarly, hawk moths, which are nocturnal and visit flowers with long throats that they hover in front of the flower, and then they unfurl their straw-like proboscis, their mouth, and they stick it in the flower and drink the nectar. Again, they don't want to go through this process if there's no reward at the end of it. It's dangerous and costly. So the nectar in the flower, because it's liquid, creates this cloud of moisture just outside of the flower. And the moths are very sensitive to that moisture, and they can tell as they're flying by how much nectar is available in the throat of the flower from that cloud and make the judgment call of whether or not it makes sense to stop and drink from that flower. And then this is the last of the insane flower superpowers, and it was just discovered in 2018. And this is researchers found that evening primrose flowers that can effectively hear bees. The flower is a perfect satellite shape, and it picks up the vibrations of passing bees. And within 3 minutes of picking up those vibrations, the flowers will then increase sugar concentrations in their nectar by 10 to 20% as a response to that bee flying past. And the researchers were actually really surprised at this. It's very funny to read their responses, but they even tested other sounds like wind and other frequencies, and they found that it is simply the frequency of bees' wings that these flowers are responding to, nothing else. And so what are flowers really offering pollinators? We already spoke quite a bit about pollen, but it's an absolute necessity for a lot of pollinators. But flowers are producing it both to reproduce themselves and then also to give it away to convince animals to help them reproduce. And some flowers will produce even non-fertile pollen, so they can just give that away and then save the good stuff for only certain visitors. But essentially, pollen is protein, which is why people are so allergic to it. It is incredibly cool and architectural under a microscope, and these wax coatings are very beautiful. Once it gets onto a stigma, you can imagine that the receiving flower, depending on the flower, could be covered with pollen from all different flowers and even the wrong species of flower and just way too many grains. But stigmas can sense which grains are from its species and which ones are healthy, and then they will encourage only those pollen grains to germinate and grow their pollen tubes down and be able to fertilize their eggs. Nectar is the other big thing that flowers offer, and that comes out of nectaries, which are most often these little cups positioned that pollinators have to brush past stigmas and anthers to get to that nectar. But sometimes flowers like this hellebore develop fancy nectaries, like these little tubes. Some nectaries aren't even on flowers. Plants will occasionally grow them on leaves and stems for a wide variety of reasons. But nectar itself is very sweet. A lot of us think of it as sugar water, and it definitely gives pollinators energy to do their work. But nectar also has amino acids and yeasts, and sometimes these yeasts will ferment, and it can get slightly alcoholic. Someone even argued last year that butterflies should be considered omnivores because the amount of crazy things that are in nectar, that it isn't just inert substances. And I like to think of nectar as like a little cup of a witch's brew, which can even have drugs in it, like nicotine and caffeine. And those substances will function for pollinators much like they do for us. They increase the energy and the memory capacity of pollinators. And so that's in the plant's best interest as well, of course. But some people think that nicotine is there also to really taste bad. And the thinking is that a visiting moth would drink that nectar and go, oh, yuck, this is disgusting, and then just leave, taking only a tiny sip, and then go to the next flower and then drink a tiny sip from that flower and say, oh, yuck, again, gross. And so it's not drinking up all of that flower's nectar. It's not taking up all those resources, and it's still getting a lot of pollination. But it's still a lot of effort to produce and then refill the nectar. So a lot of flower shapes will consider how to stop nectar from drying out or to protect it from rain. Like the throats on these phlox, the nectar is at the very bottom of this. And flowers will produce pretty thick and viscose nectar for a bee with a short tongue, and then really watery and thin nectar for moths and butterflies because it has to go up a proboscis. So the big rewards are pollen and nectar, but some bees also will collect oils from certain flowers that they use to lure in a mate. Sometimes flowers will also just offer trickery, like orchids. Orchids have crazy pollination strategies. There are fantastic lectures out there that are just on orchid pollination, but they make oils that smell like female bees. And then male bees will come and try and mate with the flower, and then in the process will pollinate the flower. And then similarly, there are lots of orchids that look like male wasps, and another real male wasp will try and go fight that flower, and then in the process pollinate that flower as well. Another thing that flowers offer us is their beautiful aromas. And that is also a method of communication, and they help pollinators find their flowers, especially at night. Moth-pollinated flowers like phlox and also tobacco, those are much more fragrant at night, and petunias as well. Bee-pollinated flowers like roses have really beautiful smells. We really like those smells. And this is a great photo of scent glands, which are on the petals of flowers. A lot of people don't realize that the scent of a flower comes from the petals. Beetle-pollinated flowers like magnolias have a really lemony, musky smell. I like it from far away, but close up it can be kind of cloying. And some flowers just don't have scents, especially those that are bird-pollinated, because birds, while they can smell a little bit, just aren't very good at smelling. So smell is something that only certain flowers will provide. And now, with the remaining 10 minutes, but I think I can do this, we're going to look at the pollinators. And we're going to look at pollination syndromes, which is essentially, what are the features of a flower that evolved for a specific group of pollinators? What does a butterfly pollinated flower look like? How does that compare to a bee pollinated flower? But it's important to keep in mind that everyone is really opportunistic here, and it's not unusual to see bumblebees on a beetle pollinated flower or vice versa. So we're just going to go over the big ones in North America. In Eastern North America, there are a lot of crazy instances of like a lemur or a gecko pollinating a tropical flower, but we just don't have time, so I'm just going to cruise through these. So the first one is beetles, and a lot of people don't think about beetles as pollinators, but because there's so many beetles on Earth, they're actually a huge pollinating force. And beetle pollinated flowers are similar to the magnolia. They are cup shaped and they're really robust. Things like water lilies and spice bushes are all beetle pollinated. They're meant to hold a giant beetle, and they don't produce nectar, but they just have a lot of pollen that is high in protein, and their flowers are often white, yellow, and pink, or light colors, and the scent is often can be pretty spicy. This is an awesome story of the Virginia, the great Amazonian water lily, and sadly I'm going to skip over it. But if you're around and you want to hang out at the end and ask about it, I can skip back to it, and we'll get into it. Flies are also pollinators, and people don't like to think about flies, but a lot of flies are really cool and wonderful, and they don't provision their young. They just lay eggs and fly away, so they don't collect pollen. Flies are also generally dark, so they warm up quickly, and they operate in colder temperatures than bees, but they're very important pollinators in colder regions, and then early in the season, like right now, they are pollinators for plants like this witch hazel, which will bloom while it's still freezing outside. This fly right here is a bee mimic, It's a flower fly, and they're sometimes called hover flies as well. And I think these are the flies that people like because they don't actually know that they're flies. And they have beneficial larvae for gardeners. They eat aphids. And they are really, the flowers that they visit often are really the same flowers that short-tongued bees visit. They visit the flowers that have really available pollen. But then, of course, there are the carrion flies, and these are the flies that people don't like. And I get it, but some of them are still quite lovely, like this green bottle fly, which is pollinating a yarrow flower. And they will pollinate really open flowers like Queen Anne's lace or sambucus. And so they're really open and have tiny little flowers that are often white or pink or brown. And of course, they also are in the group that likes the rotting meat flowers, and quite a few of our spring flowers that are open really, really early adapted to be fly pollinated as well. So not just the skunk cabbage, but also some of our trilliums and jack in the pulpit as well. This is a very cool flower that is one of our native shrubs. This is the flower of the pawpaw tree, and they give us these beautiful fruits. And it is also fly pollinated, and theirs are very difficult fruits to cultivate because they have male and female trees, and there's not a really good pollination rate. So there are rumors of farmers hanging rotting meat from trees in order to attract the pollen, the flies to pollinate the pawpaw trees. And you might think, it's also gross. Hate fly pollination. But did you know that flies are responsible for the most important flower on the planet? This is the cacao tree. And these are, of course, the flowers that give us chocolate. And they are pollinated by biting midges that we all hate. But these biting midges do the most important job, which is, of course, giving us chocolate. Butterflies are also marvelous pollinators. E.O. Wilson calls them the flowers of the air, and they are very well loved, but there aren't very many exclusively butterfly pollinated flowers around here. They spend their larval phase just eating and eating, and then as an adult, their main job is to reproduce. So some adult butterflies don't even eat. And when they do eat, they exclusively drink nectar mostly, but they also, and they have a long straw-like proboscis to drink really watery nectar, but they also need minerals. So sometimes they'll do puddling and drink water from the ground. And then sometimes they'll even drink like the tears of a crocodile. You'll see a butterfly sitting at the eye of a crocodile with its proboscis and drinking the liquid of that eye. Or there's some horrible photos online of these beautiful butterflies covering the dead carcass of a deer as they drink in the minerals from that deer. But mostly it's just nectar. Butterflies will see into the red spectrum. So butterfly pollinated flowers are usually red and orange and pink. Even though they will visit many flowers, these are the ones that are butterfly pollinated. Smell is important to butterflies. Butterflies themselves will smell, and some people have a theory that certain flowers began giving off scents in order to mimic butterflies. But for flowers that are butterfly pollinated, like this azalea, the most important thing they need to provide is a place for the butterfly to land. So the butterflies will land on the flower, grip the flower with its feet, flutter their wings, and then the anthers will hit the butterfly in the wing, and that's how they pollinate. Moths often also don't eat as an adult, like this Luna moth or silk moths, they don't eat as an adult. But those that do feed as adults are generally nocturnal or crepuscular, and which means that they need to see their flowers in the nighttime or in low light. So moth-pollinated flowers are often white or light purple, and they open at night, like this datura, or they smell really strongly at night, like phlox. And here is a clear-winged hawk moth that is active during the day, and she is the pollinator partner for our native Monarda fistulosa, which is pretty cool. And this is the tobacco plant. These are the leaves where tobacco comes from, and this plant is moth-pollinated. And the nectar, as I mentioned, contains the nicotine of the plant, and that deters some insects from drinking that nectar, so only the pollinator partners are able to drink it. And also, as I mentioned, the thinking is that it keeps visits brief. The flowers will open at night, and they are white, but the pollinator of this plant is a hawk moth. And the larvae of that hawk moth is a hawk moth. Let's see if I have a picture. I don't. Is a hornworm. And the hornworm lives on the foliage of the tobacco plant. And the tobacco plant is upset that someone is eating its leaves and can tell who is eating its leaves. The plant can sense through the saliva of the caterpillar which animal it is and know that it's this hawk moth caterpillar eating it. And if there's too many of them on the plant has a strategy to deal with that. So what it does is stops blooming at night, and the flowers will shift from white flowers, and they will then bloom during the day, and they will be pink. And so what they're doing is switching from being a moth pollinated plant into being a hummingbird pollinated plant. So the plant stops calling out to hawk moths and then switches over into being a hummingbird pollinated plant. And I'm going to skip this guy. This is our yucca moth, and jump right into wasps. And we're almost done. We're coming up at 1 o'clock, but we just have 3 more groups of plants, and then I'll stop this lecture for the quiz. And then those of you who want to hang out for the quiz can hang out for that section as well. So wasps, as I mentioned, they came before bees, and bees evolved from wasps. They visit flowers like this one, but they don't collect the pollen. They just eat it. And they feed their young meat. As I mentioned, they'll paralyze a caterpillar. And they generally visit the same flowers as flies, like really available flowers. And they're not really that scary. They're kind of like single mothers, but I won't get into it. Most wasps are parasitic. They're teeny tiny guys that will eject their eggs straight into a caterpillar host like this, and does this to your hornworms in your garden. There's also, these are some of the wasp pollinated orchids that I mentioned before that the wasps will either try to mate with or fight in order to pollinate. And then again, I'm going to skip this amazing story of fig pollination with wasps, which is absolutely mind-boggling. And so please someone asks me about that during the Q&A. And then I'll jump straight into bees. There's a ton of bees. People often know about honeybees and bumblebees, but there's more than 400 species of bee in New York and more than 4,000 of species of bee in the US. And honeybees are not one of our native bees. They are agriculturally managed livestock, like cows. And our native bees are ecologically critical to this region, and honeybees are not, just FYI. Our bees are mostly small and fuzzy. They are electrostatically charged, and only female bees will deliberately gather pollen and bring it back to their nests. The males will still visit flowers, but they're also just eating there. Bees also exhibit high flower consistency, which means that they visit the same flower species again and again, and plants really like that, so they have those relationships with them. They have all sorts of life cycles and strategies. Some are social, but most are solitary. Many live in the ground or in hollow stems of plants. Some, like the squash bee, will sleep in flowers. Some will make their homes from leaves, and some, not native bees, but from in other countries, will make their homes out of flower petals themselves. But they all gather pollen for their young, and they raise their babies on that pollen. And many of them have a special place in their bodies with special hairs that have evolved specifically for gathering pollen. And they really like flowers that look beautiful and smell delicious to us because they see in UV light. They love flowers that are blue and purple and white and pink and yellow. And most of the best scents on Earth were really designed by bees, like roses and lavender and lilac. Those we have bees to thank for. And I think we have a lot in common with bees. We like what they like. But there are long-tongued bees and short-tongued bees, and that dictates which flowers they can visit. So the short-tongued bees can visit asters and sunflowers, and the long-tongued bees can go after penstemon and pea flowers and flowers with throats. Bumblebees are the teddy bears of the insect world. They have large colonies and need a lot of pollen. And they are really consistent about the species they visit. And as I mentioned, they're strong flyers, so a lot of plants have mutualistically developed pollinator partnerships with bumblebees, like Baptisia and lupin, gentians, bleeding hearts, things that are really difficult to pollinate. Those are often bumblebee. And they do an amazing job of pollinating, and they can do something very cool that few other bees can do, which is called buzz pollination or sonication. And when they land on a flower, they can unhook their wing muscles from their wings and use those muscles to vibrate their bodies. And that vibration, which is at middle C, helps the pollen release from anthers and shake or even explode onto the bees. And plants like tomatoes require this for pollination. They require that vibration. And in industrial agricultural systems, farmers that don't have bumblebees will literally put their tomatoes on vibrating mats in order to pollinate them. And again, I've got a great video of this that I will post to Instagram after this. Carpenter bees are the largest bees. They eat holes into wood. They're not amazing pollinators, but what they do is nectar rob. They use those strong wood-cutting jaws to chew holes in the throats of flowers, and then they don't pollinate anything. They just bypass the pollination and just go straight for the nectar. They're called nectar robbers. You can see here is one biting a hole in a blueberry flower, and here's that hole that she bit. And once that hole is opened, it's a free-for-all. Nobody else wants to go through the work of pollinating a flower if there's just a route straight into the nectar. So here's a bumblebee taking advantage. Here's a bumblebee on a cardinal flower just going straight in. Honeybees are amazing, but I'm not really going to talk about them. They are, as I mentioned, they make honey, which is amazing, and they are the only bee around here that makes honey. But there are a couple other stingless bees in other places in the world which make honey, but they're pretty lazy pollinators. They tend to hover over a flower before really going in. They only visit the top of a flower. They won't go to all the underneath flowers. They only fly in really perfect weather. Native bees are much better pollinators, even in our crops, but the native bees can't be used and abused in the ways that honeybees can just be moved around by the billions, just shipped around in boxes and open up in a farm for almonds and then shipped back to the Midwest. And they're treated really, really badly, which is why industrial agriculture is so reliant on them. But they're not a conservation issue. Even though their populations are down, that's because of their terrible treatment. And they can actually harm native pollinators by spreading diseases and outcompeting them. Studies have shown now that where foraging is limited, like in resources, like in cities, honeybees can outcompete native bees for those limited resources. And in Brussels, where honeybees are even native, they've had to limit urban beekeeping permits because they got so popular that their native bees were getting harmed. So if you're excited about beekeeping, that's awesome, but you really should take it upon yourself to plant a ton of flowers if that's what you're going to do as well. And our last pollinator are birds that we have around here. And of course, in the Northeast, we have one pollinating bird, and that is our ruby-throated hummingbird. And they used to think that these birds couldn't smell at all, but they can. But bird-pollinated flowers, as I mentioned, they're not really aromatic. They are almost without exception red, yellow, and orange. And you can see here that they're often hang upside down because hummingbirds are able to do this hovering. And you can see here that this tiger lily, the anther is going to hit this hummingbird on the throat as she pollinates this flower, as opposed to butterfly pollinated tiger lilies, which are different and also give that butterfly a place to land, and then those anthers are hitting that butterfly on the wing. So it's just neat to see how within the same genus of flower, different ones that are pollinated by different animals have different morphology. Hummingbird pollinated native flowers around here are so beautiful, and you should all have them in your garden. They are red and tubular and often like kind of moist environments. And we even have some vines like trumpet vine and our native lonicera that are hummingbird pollinated, and even a tree. This is Aesculus pavia that has these beautiful red flowers that are hummingbird pollinated. And this is a migratory bird, and one of the cool things about its migration from Mexico all the way up to us is that as it flies across the country, you get these waves of different red flowers flowering as those migratory birds pass through. And so, Penny, if you are there, I'm going to end the official part of this presentation and jump into the quiz part of it. And then open it up for questions for everyone. Should I just jump right into the quiz, or should I open it up for questions first?
Go ahead with your quiz.
Okay, it's pretty short. So, what do you think pollinates this flower? It is, of course, and I wish I could see you. I normally give this lecture to real people in real life,
These
but
are
it is.
real people.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Sorry. Yes, of course. Of course, it is a hummingbird. The nectar is in this little bulb at the top of the columbine, where it is held there and protected, and the hummingbird is the only thing that can reach it up there. How about this flower? This is, of course, pollinated by flies. Our native yarrow is fly pollinated, but it's available pollen, and a lot of different animals are going to take advantage of it. So it's not unusual to see different things. How about this flower? What do you think pollinates this flower? This is, of course, wind pollinated. It is not a showy flower. It's just green, and it is a grape flower. This is the flower of our grapes. And this flower we looked at, but this is a flower that is, of course, pollinated by bees and other bees and flower flies and just really anything that can visit it. You can see butterflies, wasps, so many different types of animals will take advantage of these openly pollinated flowers. And then this is a trick question, which is, what is pollinating this flower? And the answer is absolutely nothing. That the anthers, the reproductive parts of these Echinacea, have been turned into petals. And so while this is maybe a cool flower in some people's eyes, it is not an ecologically beneficial flower because pollinators cannot get pollen or nectar from it. How about this totally insane flower? This is a passion flower. And you can see here that the anthers are really far away from the flower itself. And it's just ridiculous to think that some pollinator was like, this is what this flower should look like in order to attract me. It just needs to be totally insane. And we have a tropical carpenter bee to thank for our just absolutely ridiculous passion flowers. And that is it. I want to thank everybody. I'm putting my email up here, but you can also follow me on Instagram, and I will post all of the videos that I wasn't able to show you today. I also run a Facebook page called Pollination Ecology, which you can follow, and I just dump a lot of cool articles there about pollinator facts as well. And so thank you everyone for coming to this lecture today and for bearing with the technical difficulties.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. We do have several questions, and we'll zoom through them as quickly as we can. Back at the beginning of your presentation, what were the smaller insects doing on the lupin?
So some of those insects can still gain access to those resources. So they might be able to find some pollen that is sitting on the flower, or there might be a hole in that flower that had been the result of nectar robbing. So again, even though these are specialized flowers, they are still able to be visited by a wide variety of insects, and they can only be pollinated by their pollinator partners.
Very good. This listener would love to know what the resources and studies are that you referenced about wind pollination dynamics. Is that something, if you have resources such as this, or there are a couple of additional questions, if you can send them to me, I can distribute them when I distribute the link to the recordings to everyone.
Absolutely. But one note on that is that this information is profoundly difficult to find. And that I chase after it just absolutely rabidly because it's my passion. But there's a lot of old textbook that have this information, and then just going straight to researchers who study this stuff and watching their awesome videos of pine cones in the wind, which I can try and post as well.
Okay, very good. Is feeding by bees, moths, etc., costly in terms of calories for them?
I meant when I said that it was costly, I meant that it's expensive for the flower to produce these resources, right? And it's costly from the pollinator's perspective because it takes a lot of energy to forage. It's that's their one of their main expenditures is flying around all day and visiting flowers in order to collect pollen and nectar. It takes thousands upon thousands of honeybee visits to make one drop of honey for us to consume. And so it's just a very laborious process, and that's why I meant it was expensive, but also calorically as well.
And is feeding also costly in terms of the predators that end up consuming the pollinators?
Yeah, I mean, being a predator is hard work. You gotta stalk things and hang out. But I think that's just it is costly. That's their job, right? That's what they're doing. It's very, very fun if you're in a garden and you find one of these predators like a wheel bug, to sit and just watch them try and catch pollinators.
Very cool. This is a question about clients always thinking that the goldenrod is the problem. Do you have any suggestions for how to communicate that it's really the ragweed?
I mean, I think showing people photos and telling that fascinating story is always a good one. I think when working with clients and when teaching people about ecology in general, telling stories is always the best way to go. And I think just, explaining to people about pollen flying through the air I'm hopeful that that's fascinating to most people.
Okay. We had a question about a purple flower earlier, and then I think there was a follow-up, but I'll have to get to that as we go down the list. Uh, Next question. If you had to plant only a few plants for pollinators, what would they be?
Sure, so that's a really good one, and there's lots of great lists from the Xerxes Society and the Audubon Society as well. And I also want to plug that today at 4 o'clock, the Audubon Society is putting on a webinar, which dovetails really well with this one, that I will post about on my Facebook page, and it's about much more information about specific pollinators, specific bees, and stuff like that. But they make these lists, and those lists are often topped by asters, and that is because asters will bloom so late into the season. They have such a long bloom period because they have so many flowers, and their pollen is so readily available. The other important thing to plant in this region, at least, are spring ephemerals, because when queen bumblebees are just waking up, they really need those resources available right then.
Very good. What flowers bloom at night that would be good choices to plant to encourage more moths and butterflies to visit the night garden?
Totally. There's wonderful moon gardens, and there's both native and exotic flowers that attract moths. There are datura is one of them that I mentioned. Phlox is one of them. The very weedy vines that have tubular flowers, the moonflowers, and then what are those called, Penny? They're blue and they bloom for a day and they're like abundantly common.
Morning glories?
Yes, thank you. Morning glories. Morning glories are one of those flowers that are moth pollinated as well.
Thank you. Is it good to put bee houses in the garden?
That's complicated. I think flowers are always better. I mean, bee houses can be amazing because they allow you to really observe bees closely, which is fun. But they can also, if they're not kept up, they can be great places for disease to spread or predators to find the bees. So you don't want to just put a bee house out and then walk away from it. You really need to clean it regularly, and it's an investment. But if you do that, then it's perfectly fine.
Okay. Back to the purple flower. Is it Etienne Frassard? Butchered this pronunciation, I'm sure.
Oh, that is the name of the photographer
Oh.
of that picture. But I wish I could see that purple flower, but I can't. But if you email me, I will tell you what it is.
Very good. Um, comment that devil's weed looks like tobacco and is used as a medicinal. Do you know if that acts the same way with pollination?
Couldn't tell you. I don't know, unfortunately.
Okay. Can you tell us about the tropical water lily?
Ooh, yes, I can, and I can get back to that picture. Let's see if I can get back to it. So that is from the Amazon, and it is beetle pollinated, and when the flowers first come up, they are white, and then a beetle will fly to this flower, and the flower will then close in on this beetle and trap it inside for all night. The beetle gets trapped there and buzzes around and pollinates the flower. And then when the flower opens again the next day, it's pink. So it changes color to show that it has been pollinated and no other pollinator should visit it.
That is very cool. Great story. This next question is for home gardeners in Brooklyn, especially those with limited space and reliance upon containers. What would you recommend for plants for pollinator support?
Again, I think asters are great. Milkweeds, you can grow swamp milkweed in a pot if you have full sun. There's a really great, you can grow Zizia, golden Alexanders really easily, and that's a host plant for our native swallowtail butterflies. So you can grow flowers for pollinators to visit, and you can also grow host plants which caterpillars can eat, and you can support that part of the life cycle of butterflies and moths as well.
And what would you recommend for early season in
a
the
container
condition?
specifically?
Mm-hmm.
I love my early season native plants that I think are so beautiful are Aquilegias, although getting a hummingbird to come to your pot in the city is almost impossible. But there's lots of wonderful dicentras and bloodroots that are all bumblebee pollinated, and then Trillium as well is really hardy and can happily live in a pot.
Great. What was the name of the tree that you showed for hummingbird pollination?
Yes, the red buckeye. That is Aesculus pavia, and it is called the red buckeye. It's a beautiful tree.
Excellent. Why is most pollen yellow?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that. It might be because of the colors of protein, and it might be that it signals so easily, or it reads so easily in the eyes of pollinators. But there are few instances of pink pollen and blue pollen. Poppies have interesting colored pollen, but those are pretty rare. Pollen is almost always yellow.
Excellent. We've had many requests for you to tell us about the fig pollination
Okay.
wasps.
Hooray, hooray. All right. Let me find that here. Okay, so figs are crazy. Their flowers inside a fig fruit that you eat contains a ton of flowers. Those flowers are inside that fruit. You never see them. They're always inside, even when they're blooming. And every seed that you crunch down on in a fig is the result of an individual flower that has been pollinated by a very, very small wasp. And these wasps, when the figs are ready to be pollinated, they send out a wonderful scent, and the wasps will climb into the tiny hole of the fig. And the female wasp specifically will climb in that tiny hole, usually bringing pollen in, and they will climb around. This is how small they are. They're very small. They will climb around in that fig and pollinate the flowers inside the fig while they are laying their eggs in those flowers. And so all the eggs and the seeds of the fig are developing at the same time. And then when those eggs develop into adults that are ready to emerge in the fig still, the males will hatch out first, and they will go around inseminating the females while they are still in their little shells, in their encasements. And then they use up all their energy doing that work, the males do. And as their last act, they climb to that little hole in the fig and they bite it, and the air rushes in to the inside of the fig, and that triggers all of the females to wake up and pupate, come out of their eggs essentially, and then fly out of that fig and go find another fig to lay their eggs in, because they're inseminated at that point. The males never make it out of the figs. And so this is morbid, but every fig, not every fig, but many of the figs that we eat have a bunch of wasps, long ago decomposed, and it's extra protein, but inside the fig. Although many American figs that we grow here are self-pollinated. So the brown turkey fig that was introduced, because they didn't know this always, they couldn't figure out how to pollinate them. Farmers and agricultural researchers have developed self-pollinating figs. So not every fig is filled with dead wasps, but just the really good ones are.
Excellent. Thank you. Can you tell us what the pollination process looks like for mason bees?
So mason bees, you know what? If you're interested in mason bees, I really recommend the Xerxes Society lecture later today. They're going to go into it at length, and they do a really good job of talking about agriculturally managed native bees, like a lot of mason bees and blue orchard bees that are utilized in a lot of stone fruit production. And so they come out, they really like things like cherries and apricots and apples, and they visit a lot of really available flowers as well, like really open sort of rose flowers.
Excellent. What books can you recommend on this ecology topic?
Totally. So Xerxes Society, again, they are the leaders in this field. They have some really marvelous books on gardening for pollinators. And then Heather Holm is a marvelous lecturer and author. She writes amazing books where she's literally just like hanging out in her backyard, taking photos and learning this and sharing it with the rest of us. She's amazing. But again, this information is really, really hard to find. And so I like chase after it. So there's not a lot of good books that like explain this stuff clearly.
Okay. If pollinators are making foraging decisions primarily based on flower structure, color, fragrance, nectar, etc., does the origin of that particular plant matter so long as it delivers the goods?
Oh, so I think the person here is asking about whether or not native plants are more important to pollinators than exotic plants. And there is a widely discussed debate about this, and it depends on where you live and what ecosystem you live in. I personally believe that native plants are absolutely critical, and that it does matter, because again, it is just sheer hubris to think that we understand this well enough to say, okay, my petunias are going to perform this same function, or my tulips or my butterfly bush is going to be as important to a butterfly as milkweed, or a plant that they have evolved alongside of. So it's pretty easy to get pollinators to visit flowers, and they are, as I said, opportunistic, but we don't know about all of the medicinal aspects of those visits, about the energy expenditures of those visits, and we do know that those dynamics between native plants and pollinators are very, very critical for conservation for both, and for like plenty of other animals as well. So I'm a big fan of using native plants. I like an 80-20 rule in just about everything. I definitely have delphinium in my backyard, but like 80 to 90% of my plants are native to this region.
Excellent. Can you recommend a planting pattern Is there some particular way to space or place plants that are more beneficial for pollinators?
Yeah. So I have a whole other talk that I could maybe give at some point in the future that is about gardening and designing gardens specifically for pollinators. And there's lots of really cool research on this, like butterflies and bumblebees want to see big groups of consistently colored flowers that they can, and especially for the bumblebees, that they can visit regularly over the years that they'll, or over the season, they'll communicate to their sisters, hey, there's a big mauve patch over there. And so if you have a mauve patch of sort of similar flowers that cycle out over the course of the season, it makes it easier for those bees to locate those flowers. Similarly, they found that for monarchs with their famous relationship with milkweed, they will visit milkweed more when it is planted on the edge of a garden. And that is because it's not going to be as crowded around by other plants, and the butterflies can get to that plant easier. It's safer. There aren't as many predators. So there's recommendations now to put milkweed on the edges of garden beds.
Ah, very good. This is a question about making sugar water for hummingbirds. I bet you have an opinion on that.
It's hard, right? Like it's hard. Like, of course you want to have hummingbirds come to your window. That's like so understandable. And but you really need to take on the responsibility of doing that very seriously if you are going to do it, and make sure it stays clean, and healthy. And then I think it's only fair to also provide, at the bare minimum, access to flowers that those hummingbirds are also going to visit. So whatever medicinal properties they're going to get out of an actual nectar, as opposed to sugar water, that they're also able to get that as well.
Okay, good suggestion. Back to the meat flowers, quote unquote. If they are getting hot, where is that energy being stored?
It's not necessarily being stored, right? It's just sort of being given away. It's in the it's in the tissue of the plant. Like, a lot of the parts of the plant are specifically constructed to hold and then send out that heat. But it's not like they have a battery or anything.
Okay. Was the book that you mentioned by Heather Holm something that would help us distinguish between flies and bees?
Yes, totally. Absolutely. And again, Xerxes webinar at 4 o'clock today. We'll do that very thoroughly.
Okay, great. And also distinguish hornets and wasps?
Does her book go through hornets and wasps? I'm not sure, but it very well might.
Okay, very good. Can you tell us about the yucca mouthpiece that you skipped?
Sure. So that is this wonderful little moth, that is so yuccas are moth pollinated. And wherever we have them, we have this lovely little white yucca moth. And this is one of the only, if not the only, animals that pollinate intentionally. So in order for these, for the young of this little moth to develop, they need to develop in a growing seed of a yucca. And for that growing seed to grow, it needs to be pollinated. And so these little moths will take the pollen from one flower, move to another flower, and hold it in their little arms and actively pollinate that flower. And this is a photo that I took. You can clearly see this on a summer night. You can watch this process happening. It's really beautiful.
Excellent. Can you talk a little bit about double and semi-double flowers and how that affects pollinators?
Sure. So for whatever reason, it's really easy to turn anthers into petals. And so that a wild rose is very different from a rose that you buy in a grocery store. There's a wild rose has 5 petals, and a grocery store rose can have like 100 petals. And that's because those anthers have been shifted over into petals. And so when flowers that are so beautiful, like peonies, there's a lot of flowers that look like this, have those anthers switched out to petals, they just don't have those resources available. And that can be fine if it's a small portion of your garden, and a serious problem if animals are relying on those resources. And I think a good example is that cultivar of bloodroot that people love that is a double bloodroot. I can't remember the name of it. Penny, do you remember?
I don't.
But it's a double flower, but it doesn't have any of the resources that bloodroot like provides for bumblebees waking up. And as a result of it not having, it's just petals essentially and not really flowers, it flowers for a very long time. And so people love to plant it for that reason, but it's not doing that ecological job.
Interesting. Can you talk a little bit about the harm of tilling or raking leaves?
Sure. Again, I think that the Xerxes Society will go over that, and I also go over this in my other presentation, but there's a lot of ground nesting bees, and then a lot of bumblebees will live in the duff layer of leaves underneath a plant. And so when you rake those out, even if you're going to compost them, you can be raking out a bunch of bees. And so it's always good to leave the leaves wherever possible. And tilling can be particularly destructive, not only for the networks of fungi that live in the soil, but also for all of those ground nesting bees. And some crops like squash must be pollinated by squash bees. And those squash bees will live at the base of your squash plants. And if you till in that area, you're going to kill the bees that you rely on. And so there's a lot of really fascinating research about the harm of tilling, and not harming bees is one of those reasons.
Okay, very good. You mentioned that bats are also pollinators. What type of plants would attract bats?
Totally. I wish I had time to get into that. Obviously, I didn't have time to do nearly everything I wanted to. But bats, there are American and North American bat pollinators out in the West, and they mostly visit cacti. And they will hover in front of a plant, and they will lick at the flower and drink the nectar, and in the process, they will pollinate it. But those are mostly cacti.
Okay, very good. Can you recommend a couple of pollinator plants for shadier gardens?
All those spring ephemerals I mentioned are all really good, as well as the Aquilegia. There's also plenty of shade asters. If you're in the New York region, there is the heartleaf aster and the whitewood aster. There is a eupatorium for shade and a milkweed for shade. There are some sedges that can support the life cycle of butterflies. They don't pollinate them, but they will rear their young on them. There's a lot, and even things like heuchera can have tiny little bees that will visit it. So a lot of any native plant that you plant that flowers, and also tiarella is a really great one. Tiarella has a specialist bee that we've been trying to get into Brooklyn Bridge Park that we haven't gotten yet, but tiarella is a marvelous plant, and then all the phloxes, of course, as well.
Okay, very good. So we still have many more questions, but I'm going to ask you to wrap it up with this last one. Can you talk just a little bit about specialist bees and how important it is to plant for them?
Sure. So that's really the goal, right? Like the generalists are easy. They will visit a wide variety of flowers, and you probably already have them in your landscape. Whereas the specialists are the ones that are hard and are only going to, they might have a specific relationship with a specific plant, and when they need to provision their young, if that plant is missing, they can't survive in your area. And so that's what we're always looking for at Brooklyn Bridge Park and in my backyard. We're always trying to see if we can find those specialist bees, if we can plant for them and attract them, because those are delicate food webs that we want to encourage. So we plant specialist plants like tiarella. Sunflowers have great specialist bees that will visit them, and Jared Fowler is a marvelous bee researcher, and he has a page on his website that I will also post to my Facebook page that is just a list of specialist bees of the Northeast and which flowers they visit.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. We've had many, many, many positive comments about the presentation, and thank you for taking us through a walk in the garden and sharing all of this fascinating information with us.
Thanks so much, Penny. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.